He snatched the rifle case from her hands and hurled it into the sand hard enough to split the latches. "You have 30 seconds to pick that up and disappear." Every man on the base heard it. Nobody moved. Vera looked at the case in the sand. She looked at his hands still shaking from the throw. She looked at his face, which was absolutely certain it had just won something. Then she looked past him toward the eastern ridge for exactly 3 seconds. She picked up the case. She said nothing. She walked away. Commander Ethan Hale had no idea he had just made the last mistake of his career. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel right now and follow every part of this story to the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The rifle case hit the sand with a sound that silenced everything within 20 meters. Not a gunshot. Not an explosion. Just the dry thud of leather and metal meeting desert ground thrown by the hand of a man who had decided in under 15 seconds that he did not want Vera Callaway anywhere near his operation. The soldiers who witnessed it did not speak. Some looked away. A few watched with the careful, neutral expressions of men who had learned a long time ago that inserting themselves into a commander's confrontation was the fastest way to earn a very bad week. The sun was already hammering the base with the kind of heat that made the air above the sand shimmer and bend, and the silence that followed. Commander Ethan Hale's action felt almost as thick as that heat. Vera did not move immediately. She looked at the case lying in the sand. She looked at the angle it had landed, the way the latches had held, the way the dust had risen in a small cloud around it, and then settled back down. Then she raised her eyes and looked at Hale, and the expression on her face was one he had never encountered in 14 years of commanding some of the most dangerous men the United States military had ever produced. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was not even particularly surprised. She looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has just given the wrong answer to a question everyone else in the room already knew, with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than any anger could have been. "Pick it up," Hale said again, "and walk back to whatever desk they pulled you off of." Vera crouched. She picked up the case with one hand, tested the latches briefly with her thumb, and straightened back to full height. She was not a small woman, but she was not the kind of physical presence that announced itself. She was lean, quiet in her movements, with the kind of stillness that either meant she was completely relaxed or completely focused, and it was impossible from the outside to tell which. "I wasn't pulled off a desk," she said. "Then what were you pulled off of?" She held his gaze for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and then she looked past him toward the distant ridgeline that defined the eastern boundary of Forward Operating Base Kestrel. She studied it in a way that Hale had seen experienced sniper scouts study terrain, not casually, not with curiosity, but with calculation. As though she was already measuring something that he hadn't thought to measure. "I'll tell you later," she said. "When you're ready to hear it." Then she walked away from him carrying the rifle case and did not look back. Hale stood in the sand and watched her go. He felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling. Not respect, not curiosity. Something sharper and less comfortable than either of those. The feeling a person gets when they've made a decision and something in the back of their mind immediately whispers that the decision was wrong, but pride won't let them stop long enough to examine why. He dismissed the feeling. He had a mission to plan and 3 hostages who had been in enemy hands for 11 days, and he did not have the time or the patience to reconsider a decision he'd already made. He walked back to the operations tent and got to work. Master Chief David Okafor had served alongside Ethan Hale for 9 years. He had watched Hale plan operations in conditions that would have broken most men in rain, in cold, in the particular exhausted silence of the hours after a mission gone wrong. He had seen Hale angry, focused, grieving, and afraid though. Hale would never have admitted to the last one. He knew Hale's patterns the way a musician knows a song they've played 1,000 times. Not just the notes, but the pauses between them. The places where the rhythm shifted before the listener could hear why. When Hale walked back into the operations tent with that particular set to his jaw, Okafor knew he was going to ask about the woman. "Who sent her?" Hale said. Okafor didn't look up from the topographic display he was studying. Same authority that sent the operational orders, whatever that means. It means someone made a call without consulting me. It also means she has authorization that covers her presence on this base. Hale moved to stand beside him. Authorization for what exactly? She has a rifle and a minimal kit and no team designation I can read. She's not carrying SEAL insignia. She's not carrying any unit designation at all. She walked into my base carrying a case and an attitude, and I want to know from who. Okafor finally looked up. The authorization code on her paperwork came through JSOC channels. Ethan. Level 4. I checked it. Hale went still. Level 4. That's what I said. Level 4 authorization from JSOC did not get handed out casually. It covered operational assets whose missions existed outside the standard chain of command, people who operated in spaces that didn't appear on normal mission logs, who reported to structures that weren't visible on any organizational chart a regular officer would ever see. Hale had encountered Level 4 assets exactly twice in his career, and both times the assets in question had turned out to be people who knew things that he wished he knew. I didn't say any of that out loud. Instead, he said, "She has no role in this operation. The mission plan is set. I'm not restructuring around someone who showed up without coordination." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then, "She asked me about the Eastern Ridge." Hale looked at him. "When?" "About 40 minutes after she arrived, before you even knew she was here. She asked me how thoroughly we'd mapped the high ground at 3,200 to 3,600 meters east of the target compound." "What did you tell her?" "I told her we had aerial reconnaissance from yesterday's pass." Okafor paused. "She asked when the last updated wind data from that elevation was collected. I told her the standard readings from the weather station." Another pause. "She said the standard readings from the weather station wouldn't be accurate beyond 3,000 meters because of the thermal inversion layer that develops over this type of desert basin between 0400 and 0800 hours." Hale said nothing. "She said it like she'd been thinking about it for a while." Okafor added quietly, "She doesn't have access to my mission parameters." "She doesn't need them, Ethan. She can see the terrain from anywhere on this base. And from what she saw, she drew her own conclusions." Hale looked at the display. He looked at the eastern ridgeline on the map. He thought about the thermal inversion layer, which he had not accounted for in the planning, because the weather station readings had seemed sufficient, and he felt that whisper again in the back of his mind. He pushed it aside. "She's not part of this mission," he said. Final. Sergeant First Class Priya Mehta was 29 years old, and she had spent the last 4 of those years working in intelligence support for SEAL operations at the regional level. She was the person in the operations tent who read documents. Nobody else had the clearance or the patience to read, who cross-referenced data sources that didn't obviously connect to each other, and who occasionally quietly pointed out things that the people doing the actual operational planning had missed. She had also, in the approximately 90 minutes since Vera Callaway arrived at FOB Kestrel, already identified 3 things about the new arrival that nobody else on base seemed to have noticed. First, Vera's rifle case was custom fabricated. Priya had seen enough long-range precision equipment in her career to recognize when a case was built around a specific rifle rather than purchased off a shelf to fit a standard configuration. The wear patterns on the latches suggested the case was used regularly, not stored between deployments. Whatever was inside it was Vera's primary working instrument, not a piece of gear she'd been issued for this particular mission. Second, Vera had not consulted any maps since arriving. She'd walked the perimeter of the base, once looked at the terrain from several different positions, and then stopped moving and simply stood at the eastern fence line for approximately 12 minutes, doing nothing visible except looking at the ridge. Third, when Vera finally moved away from the fence, she went directly to the motor pool and had a 15-minute conversation with Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Reyes, who managed the base's equipment inventory. Priya didn't know what was said, but she knew that Reyes was the only person on base who had access to the real-time atmospheric sensor data that the base collected but rarely bothered to actually analyze. Priya thought about these 3 things, and then did something that was not technically part of her job description. She walked across the base to where Vera had set up her minimal kit in the far corner of the transient accommodations, knocked on the doorframe, and waited. Vera looked up from the small notebook she was writing in. The notebook had no markings on the cover. She held the pen in her left hand. "Sergeant Mehta," Vera said. "Not a question. You know my name. I know most of the names on this base. I've been here long enough to learn them." Priya stepped inside. "You arrived 4 hours ago." "Long enough," Vera said. Priya looked at the rifle case on the bed beside Vera. She looked at the notebook. She looked at Vera's face, which was the face of a woman who was waiting to find out what kind of conversation this was going to be. "You talked to Chief Reyes," Priya said, "about the atmospheric data." "I did. Because of the thermal inversion layer." Vera's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to register that she had recalibrated something. Most people in intelligence support don't know what a thermal inversion layer does to long-range ballistic trajectory at this elevation. Most people in intelligence support haven't spent 2 years attached to a precision fire support unit in conditions similar to these, Priya said evenly. A pause. Then Vera said, "Sit down, Sergeant." Priya sat. "Tell me what you know about tomorrow's mission," Vera said. "I know the outline. 3 hostages, remote compound, pre-dawn insertion to beat the heat, planned extraction before the satellite window closes. Tell me what concerns you about it." Priya looked at her. "You first." Vera didn't hesitate. "The insertion route runs through a canyon that provides excellent cover from aerial detection, but creates a kill zone at the northeastern end if the enemy has assets placed on the elevated ground above it. The only counter to that position is a firing solution from the eastern ridge. The eastern ridge requires a shot at somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 meters, depending on exact enemy placement in early morning atmospheric conditions that the base's standard weather data doesn't accurately represent." She paused. "The mission plan as currently designed has no asset capable of that shot and no contingency for that scenario." Priya stared at her. "Your turn," Vera said. "The communication window," Priya said. "The extraction timeline assumes the satellite window stays open until 0720. But I pulled the updated orbital data this morning, and the window closes at 0704. That's 16 minutes shorter than what the mission plan is built around." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "Does Commander Hale know?" "I filed the updated data in the system 2 hours ago. Whether he's read it yet, I don't know." Vera closed her notebook. She looked at Priya with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite assessment, but somewhere between the two. "You should tell him tonight, not file it. Tell him directly. He may not want to hear it from me." "He may not," Vera agreed. "Tell him anyway." That evening, Commander Hale reviewed the mission briefing with his team one final time. His SEAL platoon was 12 men. He had hand-selected each of them over 3 years of working together, and he trusted them in the way that only comes from having been in situations where trust is the only thing that stands between a living person and the alternative. There was Okafor, who was the operational backbone of everything they did. There was Lieutenant Carlos Vega, 26 years old, and already operating with a precision that reminded Hale of himself a decade earlier, which was both encouraging and occasionally alarming. There was Petty Officer First Class James Whitmore, who had the kind of quiet competence that never called attention to itself and never failed when it was needed. And there were 9 others, each of them excellent. Each of them exactly the kind of person that Commander Ethan Hale had built his professional life around working with. He stood in front of the tactical display and walked through the plan one more time, and as he did, he felt the old familiar current of readiness move through the room. This was what he was built for. This was where everything made sense to him. "Questions," he said when he finished. From the side of the room, Sergeant Mehta spoke up. "Commander, the satellite extraction window. I need to flag a discrepancy between the current plan timeline and the updated orbital data I filed this afternoon." Hale looked at her. "I saw the updated data. The window closes at 0704, Commander. The plan builds an extraction to 0720. We'll be out before go 700. Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure it was verbally confirmed rather than just in the file. There was a brief silence. Then Hale said, "Confirmed. We'll be out before 0700. Anything else?" No one spoke. Almost no one. From the back of the room a voice said, "The Eastern Ridge." Every head turned. Vera Callaway was standing in the doorway of the operations tent. She had not been invited. She had not knocked. She was holding a single sheet of paper that she'd clearly printed from the base's atmospheric sensor data, and she held it out toward Hale with the same calm expression she had worn when he threw her case into the sand that morning. "You don't have a firing solution for the northeastern canyon exit," she said. "If the enemy has fighters on the elevated shelf above that canyon, your team has no counter." The room went very quiet. Hale looked at her. He looked at the paper she was holding. He looked back at her face. "You were not invited to this briefing," he said. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." "Then I need you to leave." She held the paper out for one more second. Then she set it carefully on the nearest table and walked out without another word. Hale looked at the paper. He did not pick it up. He looked at his team and said, "We move at 0230. Get some rest." He waited until the room had emptied. Then when he was alone, he walked to the table and picked up the paper. He read it twice. He set it back down. He stared at the tactical display for a long time, and the whisper in the back of his mind was not whispering anymore. It was speaking at full volume. It was telling him something he did not want to hear, something that his pride and his years of experience, and his absolute certainty, that he understood this environment better than a woman who had walked in that morning, were all working together to drown out. He picked up the paper a second time. He looked at the atmospheric data, the numbers, the trajectory calculations in the margin done in pen in small, precise handwriting. She hadn't just flagged the problem. She had already solved it. The shot from the Eastern Ridge, accounting for the actual thermal inversion data, rather than the standard station readings, was achievable at 380 meters in the early morning conditions of the following day. She had calculated the precise firing solution, the angle, the hold, the adjustment for atmospheric density in the margin of the document, like it was something she'd done for so long that it had stopped being difficult. Hale set the paper in his pocket. He did not change the mission plan. He told himself it was because the mission plan was sound, and because a well-designed operation doesn't get restructured, because someone shows up uninvited and hands the commander a piece of paper with handwritten math in the margins. He told himself that. He went to his quarters, lay down on his cot, and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours while the desert night pressed against the walls around him, and the whisper continued its work. At 02:05, 15 minutes before mission launch, Vera Callaway walked to the eastern fence line of Forward Kestrel. She carried the rifle case. She carried a pack with ammunition, a spotting kit, and enough water for 12 hours in the desert. She carried a satellite uplink device that was smaller than most people's satellite uplink devices, with a frequency that most people's equipment wasn't programmed to recognize. Chief Warrant Officer Reyes was at the fence. He had a vehicle idling 20 meters away. He looked at her. "You sure about this?" "I've been sure since I arrived," she said. "The commander's going to be furious." Vera thought about the way Hale had looked at the piece of paper she'd left on the table. She thought about the way he'd put it in his pocket. She thought about the way a person looks when they already know the answer, but aren't ready yet to say it out loud. "He'll be furious," she agreed. "And then he won't be." She got in the vehicle. Reyes drove her to the base of the Eastern Ridge. In silence, dropped her at a point where the terrain gave her the beginning of a natural elevation path, and turned back toward the base without another word. Vera looked up at the ridge. She looked at the stars above it, which were bright and unobstructed in the way that desert stars always are, and which gave her exactly the kind of light she needed to find her way up without equipment she didn't have. She started climbing. She had been climbing terrain like this since before she could clearly articulate why she was drawn to high ground. She knew it the way other people know the shape of their own houses in the dark, not by sight, but by feel. By the pressure of the earth against her feet and hands, by the weight of the pack shifting against her back, by the quiet calculation that her mind ran automatically whenever she was moving through terrain with an objective in her head. The objective tonight was straightforward: Get to the position she had identified from the fence line. Get there before the mission team reached the canyon. Be ready before she was needed. She had been doing this in one form or another for a very long time. She did not think about Commander Hale while she climbed. She did not think about the way he had thrown her case into the sand, or the way he had looked at her when she walked uninvited into his briefing. She did not think about whether he would be angry, or whether her presence on that ridge without authorization would carry consequences she would have to manage afterward. She thought about the ridge. She thought about the wind. She thought about the distance and the angle and the atmospheric conditions that would be present in approximately 4 hours when the sky began to lighten and the thermal inversion layer settled into exactly the pattern she had calculated. She thought about 3 people in an enemy compound 11 days into captivity who did not know that anyone was coming for them. She climbed, and somewhere below and to the west, Commander Ethan Hale was moving his team through the darkness toward a canyon. He believed he understood. With a plan, he believed was sufficient, carrying a piece of paper in his pocket that he hadn't entirely let himself think about. Not yet. Not until he had to. The desert was cold in the hours before dawn, and the stars were brilliant overhead, and the only sound Vera Callaway made as she moved up the face of the eastern ridge was the soft, rhythmic sound of boots against stone, deliberate, patient, and entirely unheard by the man who had told her she had no place in his operation. She reached the position she wanted with 47 minutes to spare. She set down the rifle case. She opened it. She began the careful, practiced work of preparation. Below her in the darkness, the mission that would change everything had just begun. The mission launched at 0230, exactly on schedule, because Commander Ethan Hale had never been late to anything in his professional life, and he was not about to start tonight. He moved at the front of the column, which was not standard protocol for a commander, and which Okafor had argued with him about on multiple occasions over the years. Hale's response was always the same. He needed to feel the ground under his own feet before he could trust a plan built on it. It was a habit that had saved his team twice and irritated his superiors consistently, and he had no intention of changing it. The desert at 0230 was a different world than the desert at noon. The temperature had dropped by nearly 40 degrees from the afternoon peak, and the cold was the kind that came in through your gear and settled against your skin, and reminded your body that comfort was a thing that happened to other people in other places. The men moved quietly and quickly, because quiet and quick were the only 2 things that mattered in the window between insertion and contact, and every one of them knew it. Vega was on Hale's left. Okafor was 3 positions back, managing the rear of the column, with the particular combination of attention and apparent calm that was his signature. Whitmore was carrying the breaching kit, which meant he was carrying approximately 40 extra pounds, with the same expression he would have worn carrying nothing at all. They had been moving for 22 minutes when Hale felt it. Not a sound, not a sight. Something subtler than either of those, a quality of the silence around them that had shifted slightly from what it had been 3 minutes earlier. He raised his fist. The column stopped instantly. 12 men going motionless with a collective discipline that most military units spend years trying to achieve. He listened. 40 seconds. Nothing he could name. Just that quality of the silence, that invisible wrongness that his body had learned to recognize across 14 years of nights exactly like this one. He lowered his fist, and the column moved again, but he adjusted their angle slightly, pushing them closer to the western wall of the approach, and farther from the open ground on the eastern side. It was a small adjustment. It probably didn't matter. He made it anyway because the wrongness in the silence was still there, and small adjustments were the only tool he had against a feeling he couldn't articulate. Behind him, Okafor noticed the adjustment and said nothing. He had learned long ago that Hale's instincts in the field were not the kind of thing you questioned while you were still in the field. They reached the canyon entrance at 0318. The canyon was narrower than the aerial photographs had made it appear, which was a thing that aerial photographs almost always got wrong about terrain, and which Hale had planned for by building in a wider movement formation than the photographs suggested was necessary. The walls above them were dark and close, and the sound of the team's movement changed character. The moment they entered, compressed, bounced back at them, turned into something that felt more exposed rather than less, even though the walls on either side provided physical cover. Hale did not like canyons. He had never liked canyons. In 3 separate operations over the course of his career, canyons had produced the worst moments he had ever experienced, and the particular quality of dread that he felt moving into this one was familiar enough that he recognized it, and disciplined enough that he didn't let it change his pace. They moved through the first 300 meters without incident. At the 400-meter mark, Vega pulled up beside him and said very quietly, "Thermal signatures on the shelf, above and left, 3, possibly 4. Hale didn't stop moving. "How long have they been there?" "I picked them up about 30 seconds ago. They're not moving." Not moving meant watching. Watching meant they knew something was coming through the canyon, even if they didn't know exactly what. It meant the ambush wasn't improvised. It meant someone had placed those fighters on that shelf before the SEAL team arrived, which meant the approach had been compromised, which meant the entire careful architecture of the plan they had built over the past 3 days had a fundamental flaw that had just revealed itself at the worst possible moment. Hale kept moving. His mind was running through options the way it always did in these moments, not panicking, not freezing, just cycling through the list of available responses and eliminating the ones that didn't apply until something workable was left. The options were not good. Retreating through the canyon meant reversing a 12-man column in a narrow space in darkness, which was the kind of maneuver that looked straightforward on paper and became catastrophic when executed under pressure. Advancing meant continuing toward a position the enemy controlled. Holding meant staying inside a kill zone and waiting to see what happened, which was not a tactic so much as a prayer. The 4th option was the Eastern Ridge. He did not allow himself to think about the Eastern Ridge. "Vega," he said quietly. Thermal count again. 4 confirmed, possible 5th, but the signature is unclear. Weapons. Long arms, at least 2 of the 4. Long arms on a shelf above the northeastern canyon exit meant the enemy had selected that position specifically for its firing line down into the canyon. The angle gave them coverage across approximately 200 meters of the only viable exit route. Any team that came through that exit was going to be in that firing line for the time it took to cross those 200 meters, and 200 meters in a canyon under fire from a fixed elevated position was a distance that could contain an entire catastrophe. Hale made a decision. We go through, fast and staggered. We don't give them a clean line on a grouped target. Okafor's voice came from behind him, low and flat. "Ethan. We go through. We have 1 man who can't run that gap. Whitmore's carrying 60 pounds of breaching kit." Hale didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. He looked at the canyon ahead of him and felt the weight of what he was about to ask his team to do, and for the first time in hours, the piece of paper in his pocket stopped feeling like something he'd filed away and started feeling like something that was pressing against him physically. "Give me 60 seconds, he said. He stopped moving. He pressed himself against the canyon wall and looked up at the shelf where the thermal signatures waited in the darkness. He looked at the northeastern exit 200 meters ahead. He looked at the sky above the canyon walls, which was beginning to shift from deep black toward the kind of dark blue that preceded the false dawn. He thought about a shot at 380 meters. He thought about wind correction, atmospheric density, the thermal inversion layer that developed over this type of desert basin between 0400 and 0800 hours. He thought about a piece of paper with handwritten math in the margins calculated by a woman who had been on his base for less than 4 hours before she'd figured out the one thing his entire planning process had missed. "Master Chief," he said. Okafor moved up beside him. "Here, if there's an asset on the eastern ridge right now." He paused. His jaw was tight. "What's the communication protocol to reach her?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was the longest 3 seconds Hale had experienced since a very bad night in Afghanistan 7 years ago. Then Okafor said, "I don't know that there's an asset on the Eastern Ridge, Commander. Reyes drove her out there. I know he did. I saw the vehicle tracks when we left the base and I didn't say anything because I made a decision and I was holding to it." He paused again. "I'm no longer holding to it. What's the protocol?" Okafor reached into his kit and produced a satellite comm device on a frequency that was not the frequency Hale's team operated on. It was the frequency that corresponded to the authorization code on Vera Callaway's paperwork. The Level 4 frequency. The one Okafor had looked up that afternoon after Hale told him she had no role in the mission, because Okafor had been doing this long enough to know that sometimes what a commander says and what a commander needs are two different things, and it was a Master Chief's job to be ready for both. He handed it to Hale. Hale held it for a moment, then he keyed it. "Callaway," he said. One word. Static. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. And then, with the particular clarity of a satellite signal, finding itself in a clear sky, Hale. Her voice was even. Not surprised. Not satisfied. Just present in the way that a person who has been waiting for a call is present when it finally comes ready, without being able to say they told you so, because the situation has moved past the point where that matters. "I have 4 confirmed targets on the shelf above the northeastern exit," he said. "Possible 5th, long arms. I need a firing solution." A pause that lasted less than 2 seconds. "I have them. I've had them for 11 minutes. Something moved through Hale's chest that he didn't have a name for. "You've been watching my canyon for 11 minutes. I've been watching your canyon since I reached this position. Give me your exact current location in the column." He gave it. "Advance to the 480 mark and hold. Do not enter the final 200 meters yet." Why 480? Because at 480, the canyon wall will give you cover from their angle. Past 480, you're in their firing line. Stay at 480 and wait for my signal. "What's your signal?" she said simply. "You'll know it." He moved his team to the 480 mark. The men held position without complaint, which was one of the things Hale had always valued most about them. They didn't need explanations in the field. They needed a commander who knew what he was doing, and they trusted that when he told them to hold, he had a reason. The minutes that followed were among the quietest Hale had experienced in active combat. The sky above the canyon was now shifting toward the dark blue of approaching dawn. The cold had settled into the deep pre-sunrise cold that was the coldest point of any desert night. Somewhere above them on the eastern ridge, more than 3 kilometers away, a woman he had thrown out of his briefing was lying behind a rifle she had carried onto his base, in a case he had thrown into the sand, looking through a scope at a shelf of rock that stood between his team and the people they had come to rescue. I thought about that for a moment. He thought about what it required, the patience, the preparation, the absolute certainty of purpose that it took to climb a ridge in the dark without orders, without invitation, without any guarantee that the person you were protecting was going to use what you gave him. He thought about the expression on her face when she'd picked the case back up from the sand. The one that wasn't angry and wasn't afraid. The one that was just patient. And then the shot came. It came from so far away that they heard nothing for the first full second after it arrived. The impact registered first, a sharp defined sound from the shelf above the canyon exit, followed by movement, followed by the particular kind of chaos that happens when people who believe they had a controlled situation suddenly discover they don't. One of the thermal signatures disappeared from Vega's display. The remaining 3 moved not toward the exit, but laterally trying to find new cover, which meant they didn't know where the shot had come from, which meant the range and the silence of it had disoriented them completely. "Go," Hale said. The team moved through the northeastern exit in a staggered pattern that covered the 200 meters in less time than it would have taken him to explain why the formation worked. They crossed the gap while the enemy was still repositioning, still looking the wrong direction, still trying to understand what had just reached them across 3.5 kilometers of desert darkness. Another shot. The second one took out the fighter who had moved farthest toward the exit and who had been closest to re-establishing a firing line on the canyon mouth. The third shot came 40 seconds after the second, and by the time it arrived, Hale's team was already in cover beyond the exit, and the enemy on the shelf had made the decision that surviving was preferable to fighting a phantom they couldn't locate. They ran. Hale watched them go on Vega's thermal display. 4 men. The 5th signature had turned out to be a thermal artifact from the rock moving fast in the wrong direction, away from everything that mattered, abandoning a position that had been perfectly designed to destroy his team. He keyed the satellite comm device. "Shelf is clear." I know, Vera said. You have 18 minutes before the thermal inversion layer shifts and my shot geometry changes. Move. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He pocketed the device and looked at Okafor, who was watching him with an expression that contained approximately 100 things neither of them were going to say right now. Move, Hale said. They moved. The compound was 600 meters beyond the canyon exit, and the briefing had described it as a hardened facility with 3 confirmed guard positions and a likely 4th at the rear. What the briefing had not described, because no briefing can describe a thing that isn't there yet, was the vehicle that was now parked at the compound entrance with its engine running. Hale saw it and felt the mission timeline compress in real time. A running engine at 0400 meant someone was preparing to leave. Leaving at 0400 in a vehicle from a compound holding 3 hostages was not a planned maintenance run. They're moving the hostages, Vega said. I know. That changes the extraction point. I know. Ethan. Okafor very quietly. The satellite window. 7:04. Updated orbital data. 16 minutes shorter than the original plan. Sergeant Mehta's flag filed in the system 2 hours before the briefing verbally confirmed when he said we'll be out before 0700 and told himself that was sufficient. He looked at his watch. He looked at the running vehicle. He looked at the compound and ran through the geometry of what he needed to do in the time he had left to do it. Whitmore, he said. Breaching kit, northeast corner. We go in from the blind side of the vehicle. He paused for one beat. We have to be fast. Whitmore, who had been carrying 60 pounds of equipment through a desert canyon in the pre-dawn cold without once complaining about it, looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this instruction. Always am, sir. They moved on the compound. The next 9 minutes were the kind of 9 minutes that compress in memory afterward, not because they were unclear, but because so much happened in them that the mind sorts them differently than it sorts ordinary time. Whitmore's breach was clean and fast. The entry was clean and fast. The guard positions were handled with the particular precise economy that the team had built over years of doing exactly this, and the noise of it was controlled enough that the vehicle at the front entrance had not yet moved by the time Vega reached the room where the hostages were held. 3 people. 2 women and a man. All civilian contractors. All in a state that told the story of 11 days in captivity without requiring any words. They were alive. They were ambulatory. That was what mattered. Can you move? Vega asked the man who appeared to be the most functional of the 3. The man looked at him with the expression of someone who has decided he will move if he has to drag himself by his fingernails to do it. Yes. Good. Stay inside my shoulder and don't separate, all 3 of you. He got them to their feet. He got them to the door. He got them to Hale, who was managing the extraction geometry from the northeast corner of the compound with Okafor, watching the vehicle at the front, which had not moved yet, but which was going to move soon, because someone was going to notice that the sounds from inside the compound were wrong. Extraction route, Hale said. Back the way we came. Through the canyon, Okafor said. Through the canyon. The shelf is clear. She cleared it. Okafor looked at him for a moment that had several different conversations inside it. Then he turned and began moving the team. What happened next did not appear in any version of the mission plan, because it was the kind of thing that couldn't be planned for a thing that revealed itself only in the execution, in the gap between what a plan assumes and what a situation actually is. The vehicle at the front of the compound started moving. Not away from the compound. Toward the rear of it, which was the direction the SEAL team was moving, which meant someone inside that vehicle knew or guessed that the exit route ran behind the building and was trying to cut it off. Contact vehicle moving to intercept, Vega called. The hostages were not running fast enough. 2 of the 3 were at the limit of what 11 days of captivity had left them capable of, and the distance between the team's current position and the canyon entrance was still 400 meters and 400 meters, with 3 compromised civilians, and a vehicle moving to cut off the route was a math problem that resolved to a very bad answer. Hale keyed the satellite device. Callaway, I have a vehicle moving to intercept our extraction route, rear of the compound heading northeast. A pause. 2 seconds. Long enough to feel like its own kind of pressure. "I see it," she said. "I need you to give me 30 seconds. Hold your position." "We can't hold. The vehicle will reach our route in less than a minute." "Then you have 30 seconds," she said. "Hold." Her voice did not waver. It did not carry the particular texture of someone making a calculation they weren't certain of. It carried the flat-grounded certainty of someone who already knew what the next 30 seconds contained and was asking him to trust that knowledge, even though he had no basis for that trust, except the evidence of the last 40 minutes. He had thrown her case in the sand. He had told her she had no place in his operation. He had held the piece of paper with her calculations in his pocket for 7 hours, without acting on them until the moment he had no other choice. And she had come anyway, climbed the ridge anyway, watched his canyon for 11 minutes before he called, because she knew he would call. "Hold," he told his team. 22 seconds later, the vehicle stopped moving. It didn't slow. It didn't brake in a controlled way. It stopped the way machines stop, when the people controlling them have abruptly lost the ability to control them, which is a mechanical fact, but also a human one. The engine died. The lights cut. Silence. Okafor looked at Hale. The hostages who had been braced for whatever came next looked at the vehicle, and then at the men around them, with the wide, disoriented eyes of people who have been living at the edge of their own capacity for so long that unexpected good news feels almost indistinguishable from a trap. "Move," Hale said. They moved. All 15 of them, 12 operators, 3 hostages moving through the desert with the controlled urgency of people who understood exactly how much time they had left and exactly what it would cost them to waste any of it. They reached the canyon entrance at 0618. They moved through it through the northeastern exit where the shelf above them was empty and silent out the other side into the open desert, where the sky was now a deep luminous gray that meant sunrise was less than 30 minutes away. They moved west toward the extraction point, and as they moved, Hale looked east toward the ridge. He couldn't see her from this distance. He couldn't see anything except the ridge itself, dark and irregular against the lightening sky. He thought about a woman climbing that ridge in the dark with a pack on her back and a rifle case in her hand, and no orders from anyone, and no guarantee that the man who'd thrown her case into the sand was ever going to use what she was offering. He thought about what that kind of certainty felt like from the inside. He thought about whether he had ever, in 14 years of commanding some of the most capable people he had ever met, possessed that particular quality of belief. Not belief in his own skill, which he had in abundance, but belief in something worth using that skill for, even when the people who were supposed to recognize it had already decided they wouldn't. He didn't have an answer. He filed the question away in the same part of himself where he kept the things that needed more time than a moving extraction gave him. They reached the extraction point at 0648. The helicopter was already there. The pilot looked at the team, looked at the 3 hostages, and made the wordless assessment that pilots always make in these moments, weighing what he was seeing against what he'd been told to expect, finding that the 2 matched well enough to proceed. Hale counted his team onto the aircraft. 12 operators, 3 hostages, everyone present. He was the last one on. As the helicopter lifted and banked west, he looked out at the eastern ridge one final time. In the growing gray light, he thought he could see a figure at the top of it, small against the sky, still watching the aircraft move away. He wasn't certain. The distance was too great, and the light was wrong for certainty. But he thought he could see her. I thought she was watching them go with the same expression she'd worn when she picked her case back up from the sand. Patient, settled, and entirely unsurprised by how things had turned out. The helicopter carried them west, and the ridge fell away behind them, and Commander Ethan Hale sat with his team and the 3 people they had pulled out of 11 days of captivity, and he did not speak for a long time. He was not done thinking yet. The helicopter landed at FOB Kestrel at 0712, 8 minutes after the satellite window closed, which meant the extraction had threaded a needle that Hale had not fully believed was threadable until they were already through it. The 3 hostages were moved immediately to the medical station. The 2 women were dehydrated and showing early signs of the kind of psychological compression that 11 days in captivity produces a flatness behind the eyes, a flinching quality in their movements, as though they had spent so long bracing for impact that their bodies had forgotten how to exist without that readiness. The man whose name was Gerald Forsyth, and who had apparently spent a portion of his captivity quietly memorizing the layout of the compound, in case an escape opportunity presented itself, shook Hale's hand at the door of the medical station and said simply, "Thank you." He said it the way people say things they mean completely, without decoration, without elaboration. Because the truth of it was large enough that adding words would have made it smaller. Hale said, "You're safe now." And he meant that completely too. The debrief began 40 minutes after landing, which was the standard interval, enough time to get the team's gear secured and their bodies past the immediate physiological crash of coming off operational tension. Not enough time for the details to start blurring at the edges. Hale ran it himself in the operations tent with Okafor on his left and Vega taking notes at the far end of the table. It was by any objective measure a successful mission. The hostages were recovered. The team had taken no casualties. The enemy ambush on the canyon shelf had been neutralized. The intercepting vehicle at the compound had been stopped. Every primary objective had been met. And yet, the debrief had a quality that Hale had never experienced in a post-mission review before. A heaviness. Not the heaviness of failure, which he knew well, but something different. The weight of a thing that had almost gone wrong, that had been prevented from going wrong by a resource he had rejected, and that everyone in the room was aware of, and nobody was saying out loud. He let it sit in the room for a moment. Then he addressed it. "There's a thing we need to talk about," he said. "And I'm going to be the one who says it first because it's mine to say." He looked at the table, then at his team. The Eastern Ridge, the canyon ambush, the vehicle intercept. None of those outcomes were in our plan. They happened because of an asset I told to stay off this mission. An asset who came anyway, and who performed at a level I was not prepared to account for. He paused. That was my failure. I dismissed her based on information I didn't have, and I nearly paid for that with your lives. The room was quiet. Whitmore, who spoke rarely during debriefs, and when he did, always meant it, said, "You called her when you needed her, Commander. That's the part that matters." "It shouldn't have taken needing her," Hale said. "That's the part I'm going to think about for a long time." Nobody argued with that. He closed the debrief 20 minutes later, and as the team filed out, Okafor stayed behind. He stayed in the way. He always stayed. Not because he'd been asked, but because he understood that some conversations could only happen when there was no one else in the room. "She's not back yet," Okafor said. Hale looked at him. "She hasn't come off the ridge. Reyes checked 20 minutes ago. It had been nearly 4 hours since the helicopter extracted." The sun was fully up now, which meant the ridge was no longer the cold, dark terrain Vera had climbed in the pre-dawn. It was desert rock under direct sun, and the temperature up there was rising with the same aggression. The temperature everywhere in this basin rose once the sun cleared the horizon. "Send Reyes back out," Hale said. "With water." "Already done. He left 10 minutes ago." Of course he had. Hale nodded. He looked at the tactical display, which now showed the day's baseline configuration rather than the mission overlay, and he thought about what Vera Callaway had been doing for the last 4 hours on that ridge. She had cleared the shelf ambush. She had stopped the vehicle. She had then stayed in position because that was what you did when you were supporting a mission. You stayed until the mission was complete, not until your part of it was complete, because the mission was a single thing, and you didn't leave until it was finished. And then you made your own way off the mountain without a helicopter and without ceremony in the full heat of a desert morning. I was already walking toward the motor pool before he'd fully decided to go. Okafor watched him go and said nothing, which was also a kind of conversation. Reyes was halfway to the ridge when Hale caught up with him in a second vehicle. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Reyes had the quality of a man who understood that being quiet was sometimes the most useful thing he could contribute, and he was one of the few people on the base whose company Hale could tolerate on very little sleep. They saw her before they reached the base of the ridge. She was coming down. On her own feet at a pace that was deliberate rather than struggling, the rifle case across her back and the pack in her right hand. She looked from a distance like exactly what she was, a person who had done what they came to do and was now completing the last practical step of doing it. Reyes stopped the vehicle. Hale got out. He walked toward her, and she walked toward him, and they met on the slope in the growing heat of the desert morning, with no one else around, and nothing to manage, except the conversation that had been building since he'd thrown her case into the sand 16 hours ago. She stopped. She set the pack down. She did not set down the rifle case. She looked at him with that same expression, the patient one, the one that wasn't angry and wasn't satisfied, the one he was beginning to understand was simply who she was. "The team is back safe," he said. "I know. The hostages are with medical." "Good." He stopped in front of her. He was aware that there were 100 things he could say, and that most of them were the wrong things in the wrong order, and he had never been especially gifted at finding the right order for things that mattered personally rather than operationally. So he said the simplest version, "I was wrong about you." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You were." She didn't soften it. She didn't add anything that would make it easier for him to have said. She just let it stand there as the truth it was, and he found to his own surprise that he respected that. "I need to understand who I was wrong about," he said. "Will you tell me?" She studied him for a moment, with a quality of assessment that he recognized because it was the same assessment. He ran on people himself, not sizing them up for threat or competition, but reading whether they were asking a real question or a performative one. She picked up her pack. "Get me a cup of coffee," she said, "and I'll tell you what you're cleared to know." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. They drove back to the base. By the time they reached the operations tent with 2 cups of coffee that tasted like they'd been brewed 3 hours ago and left on a heating element that had done its honest best, Sergeant Mehta was already there. She was at her station working with the focused invisible efficiency that was her operational signature, and when Hale walked in with Vera, she looked up with an expression that went through several distinct things in rapid succession before settling into something professionally neutral. Vera sat. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She looked at the surface of it for a moment, and Hale had the sense that she was organizing something, deciding how much of what she knew was the right amount to say and in what order. "My official designation," she said, "is JSOC Special Evaluation Command Detached, which is a designation that doesn't appear on any organizational chart you have access to, and which I'm telling you only because the mission is complete, and because you asked a direct question." Hale said nothing. He waited. "My function," she continued, "is evaluation. I'm sent to active operations where a unit commander or a unit structure has been flagged for review by JSOC leadership. Not performance review. Structural review. Looking for gaps between what a unit believes about itself and what that unit actually does under pressure." The quiet in the tent took on a different texture. Mehta had stopped working. She was not obviously paying attention, but she was not paying attention either. She was doing the thing she was very good at, which was absorbing information without appearing to. "This team was flagged," Hale said. "You were flagged," Vera said, making the distinction with the same directness she had used for everything else. "Not for anything you did wrong, for a pattern. Senior commanders at your level with your record occasionally develop what the evaluation framework calls experiential rigidity. The longer someone is excellent at something, the harder it becomes for them to recognize excellence that doesn't look like their own." Hale sat back. He looked at her. "You came here to evaluate me. I came here to find out whether the flag was accurate." She paused. "The flag was partially accurate." "Partial own." Hale sat back. He looked at her. "You came here to evaluate me. I came here to find out whether the flag was accurate." She paused. "The flag was partially accurate." "Partially. You dismissed me in under 15 seconds based on incomplete information. That part was accurate." She took a sip of the bad coffee. "But you also called me when you needed to. You didn't wait until it was too late. You made the adjustment under pressure in the field, which is the hardest place to make that kind of adjustment because it cost you something in front of your team." She set the cup down. That part was not what the flag predicted. Hale processed this in silence. The morning moved around them, sounds of the base resuming its normal rhythms after an operational night. The distant voices of the medical team, the particular quality of light through the tent fabric that meant the sun was now fully committed to making the day as hot as possible. "How many times have you done this?" he asked. "This assignment. Any version of it. Evaluations, covert assessments, showing up without explanation and watching what happens." She considered the question. "Enough times that I stopped counting." "And the commanders you evaluated, what happened to them?" "Most of them got better." She said it simply without embellishment. "A few of them didn't, and those evaluations had different endings. But most of them, when they understood what they'd missed and why they'd missed it, most of them got better." Hale looked at his coffee cup. He thought about the 9 years he had served with Okafor, and the 3 years with Vega, and the 6 years with Whitmore, and the web of experience and trust and proven performance that he had built around himself and called a team. He thought about how completely natural it had felt to dismiss Vera in 15 seconds, and how completely invisible that instinct had been to him until the moment the ambush on the shelf forced him to see it. I thought about what else he had dismissed in 15 seconds over 14 years that he had never been forced to revisit. That was the thought that hit hardest. Not the specific failure with Vera. The implication of the specific failure, the pattern. It pointed at the questions. It opened up about decisions he had made and never reconsidered because nothing had ever come back to show him he should. "The calculation in the margin," he said. "The atmospheric data, the shot geometry. Yes, you did that in under 4 hours. I did that in about 90 minutes. The other time I spent confirming it with the actual sensor data from Reyes." "You've made shots at that range before." It was not a question. He said it the way you say something when the evidence has already answered it, and you're just giving the answer a voice. She looked at him steadily. "I have made shots at that range and beyond in conditions that were worse than last night, with equipment that was older than what I was carrying last night." She paused. "I am not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you because you asked who you were wrong about, and that's part of the answer." Meta at her station had shifted the angle of her work in a way that might have been coincidental, and certainly wasn't. Hale said, "What's the full answer?" Vera set down her coffee cup with a finality that meant she had decided to say the thing she'd been organizing since they sat down. "I enlisted at 19. I came up through a pipeline that didn't exist officially at the time, which meant I earned every qualification through units that weren't supposed to have someone like me in them. I was evaluated for precision fire at 23 and posted scores that put me in the top 8 of everyone tested that cycle, regardless of gender, which the evaluating officer noted in the record and then buried because he didn't know what to do with it." She said this without heat, without the particular edge that old injustices usually carry when they're spoken aloud. Just information, just fact. "I spent 6 years on direct action support in environments I can't name in a room with your clearance level. I was recruited into JSOC evaluation because the people who designed the program understood that the best evaluator for a system's blind spots is someone the system has consistently failed to see." The tent was very quiet. "They were using you," Meta said. She'd abandoned any pretense of not listening. She said it with a directness that surprised even her by the look of it. Vera turned to look at her. "No," she said, and her voice was not defensive, just precise. "They were recognizing me. There's a difference, and it matters." She paused. "I chose this work. I chose it because it does something that matters. It finds the gaps before the gaps find the mission. Before the gaps find the team." She looked back at Hale. "Before a man throws a case in the sand, and the consequence isn't an argument. It's 12 men in a canyon with no counter." Hale held her gaze. "That was a brutal way to make that point." "Yes," she said. "It was." A pause. "I needed you to see it that way. Neat lessons don't change behavior. Consequences do." He sat with that for a moment. Then Okafor appeared in the tent doorway. He looked at Vera, then at Hale with the expression of a man who had correctly guessed the nature of the conversation and had come to add something to it. "Callaway," he said. She looked at him. "The shot on the vehicle," he said. "The engine block, from the ridge. That was 460 meters by our measurement. She said nothing. The record confirmed distance for that type of shot in combat conditions. Okafor said, is 540 meters, set in 2009. I looked it up this morning. He paused. I looked it up because I wanted to understand what I saw last night. What did you see? She asked. I saw someone do something that most people in this building believe is not possible, he said. And I wanted to put a number on it because numbers are how I make sense of things. He looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to say what he means. You were protecting us before we knew we were in danger. I want you to know that I know that. The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet than the ones before it. It was the quiet of something being acknowledged that had not been acknowledged before. Of a debt being named, not fully paid but named, which was the first step toward payment. Vera looked at Okafor for a long moment. Thank you, Master Chief, she said, and the two words were not small, though she said them simply. They carried the weight of someone who had spent years operating in places where what she did was used and never acknowledged, and who had learned to not need acknowledgement to keep going, but who could still feel it when it came. Hale stood. He walked to the small table at the edge of the tent, where the satellite comm device was sitting, the one Okafor had handed him in the canyon, and he picked it up. He turned it in his hand. The authorization level on your paperwork, he said. Level 4. Yes. That means you can access the mission record. It means I can access most things. He set the device down. He looked at her directly. I want to formally request that your observations from this operation be submitted to JSOC Evaluation Command as a complete record. Not a summary, not a flag. A complete record with everything you observed. He paused. Including my initial decision at the gate. Something moved across Vera's face that he couldn't fully read. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. That record will affect your career evaluation, she said. I know. It may affect your next command assignment. I know that too. She studied him. Most commanders, when they find out they've been under evaluation, spend the rest of the conversation trying to reframe what I observed, to contextualize the early decisions, to manage the report. I know, he said again. I'm not doing that. Why not? I thought about it for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give her the real one rather than the performative one. Because if the record shows what actually happened, and someone at JSOC reads it and decides I need additional oversight or a different assignment, they're probably right. And the next commander who gets evaluated by you might benefit from knowing that a commander with my record made this mistake. That's more valuable than protecting my career rating. The room held that. Meta had her hands completely still on her keyboard. Okafor in the doorway looked at the floor for a moment, in the way that people look away when they're feeling something they don't want to show. Vera said, all right. Just that. All right. But the way she said it meant something more than agreement. It meant she had updated something in her assessment of him, and that the update was not minor. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and produced the satellite uplink device she had carried on the ridge. She plugged it into the base's secure communications port and began transmitting. Hale didn't ask what she was transmitting. He understood that it was her field record, everything she had observed and noted and calculated since the moment she had arrived at the gate and he had thrown her case into the sand. I went to stand near Okafor in the doorway while she worked. The desert morning pressed against them with its full heat, now the air already carrying the particular weight of midday approaching. She's been doing this a long time, Okafor said quietly. Yes. She climbed that ridge in the dark with no orders and no backup, and she sat up there for 4 hours in the cold, and then the heat, and she never asked for anything. No, Hale said. She didn't. That's not something you build in a training pipeline, Okafor said. That's something you build in a life. Hale thought about the things she had said. The buried evaluation score at 23. The pipeline that didn't officially exist. The 6 years in environments she couldn't name. The program that had recognized her, not because the system had developed an appetite for fairness, but because the system had finally understood that its own blind spots were a liability it couldn't afford, and that the best tool for finding those blind spots was someone the system had been looking past for years. I thought about how long it had taken. He thought about how many missions had happened in the years between 23 and now, and what those years had required of her, and whether any of the commanders who had looked at her in those years had done what he had done this morning, stood in front of her, and said without softening it that they had been wrong. He hoped some of them had. He suspected fewer than he would have liked. Meta appeared beside them. She was holding a tablet. On the screen was a file, not a summary, not a brief, but a full personnel record. She looked at Hale, then at the doorway, then back at Hale. She didn't just authorize her field record. Meta said quietly enough that her voice didn't reach across the tent. She released her full operational file to base command access. A pause. I don't think she meant for me to see the notification, but I saw it. Another pause. Commander, her file goes back 17 years. The classified portions alone are 43 pages. Hale looked at the tablet. He looked at the file. Don't read it yet, he said. Meta looked at him. Let her tell us what she wants to tell us, he said. In her own order. She's earned that. Meta lowered the tablet. In the tent behind them, Vera finished her transmission and disconnected the uplink device. She sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows the completion of something long held. Something you've carried for hours or days, and that has finally been put down. Then she stood. She picked up the rifle case. She walked toward the door of the tent. She stopped when she reached Hale. She looked at him with the expression that he had spent the last several hours learning to read the patient. One, the grounded one. The one that wasn't angry and wasn't performing and wasn't asking for anything. Only now he understood something about it that he hadn't understood before. It wasn't just patience. It was the expression of a person who had decided a long time ago that what she knew about herself did not require anyone else's confirmation to remain true. That was a kind of strength he had never tried to measure because he had not understood until this morning that it was a kind that could exist. What happens next, he said, for the evaluation? Someone at JSOC will review the record within 72 hours, she said. They'll cross-reference it with the mission outcome data. They'll make a determination about whether the flag is sustained, modified, or cleared. And you? She looked at him steadily. I move to the next assignment. He nodded. He thought about that, the perpetual motion of what she did moving from one blind spot to the next, operating in the gaps that nobody else was positioned to see, doing it in the particular solitude of someone whose work was never visible until it was over. The people you evaluated before me, he said. Did any of them ever... He paused, looking for the right word. Did any of them ever try to find out what happened to you after? She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. You're the first. She walked past him into the desert morning, carrying the rifle case, and the heat closed around her, and the base resumed its ordinary sounds around her exit, and Commander Ethan Hale stood in the doorway of his operations tent and understood with a clarity that felt like something being reset, rather than something being broken, that he was going to spend the rest of his career thinking differently about what it meant to know what someone was capable of before they had shown you. He watched her walk. He kept watching until the distance and the heat shimmer made her indistinguishable from the desert itself. The JSOC evaluation report arrived at FOB Kestrel 71 hours after Vera transmitted her field record. Not 72. 71, which meant someone at the command level had read it and made a determination faster than the standard processing window, which itself was a piece of information that carried weight, even before anyone opened the document. Hale was in the operations tent when it came through. He read it alone, which was the way he preferred to receive information that had the potential to change things. He read it twice the way he had read Vera's atmospheric calculations on the night before the mission, and when he finished the second read, he sat with it for a long moment and let it settle. The flag was modified. Not cleared, not sustained, modified. The evaluating officer at JSOC had noted the initial dismissal at the gate as a confirmed instance of the pattern the flag had identified. He had also noted the field correction, the call to Vera, in the canyon, made under pressure, before the situation became unrecoverable, as evidence that the pattern was not fixed. The language of the determination, used a phrase Hale had never seen in an evaluation document before: adaptive recognition under duress, which apparently meant the ability to recalibrate a wrong assessment when the evidence demanded it, even at personal cost, even in front of your team. The recommendation was not reassignment. It was mandatory integration of a new protocol into his unit's pre-mission planning process. A formal review step requiring that any asset attached to or available to the unit be evaluated by capability criteria before being excluded from mission planning. In plain language, no more 15-second decisions at the gate. No more dismissals based on the mismatch between what a person looked like and what a mission required. The recommendation also noted in the final paragraph that the evaluator's field record in this instance represented one of the most complete and operationally valuable assessment documents submitted to the Evaluation Command in the current fiscal year. That paragraph was not about Hale. It was about Vera, and it was written in the measured institutional language of people who don't often say things like this directly, which meant that in institutional terms, it was as close to extraordinary as the document could come. Hale printed it. He folded it and put it in his pocket next to the ghost of the atmospheric calculation he had carried through the mission, and which he had since transferred to the mission record file where it belonged. He went to find Vera. She was not where he expected her to be. She was not in the transient accommodations, and she was not at the fence line, and she was not in the motor pool talking to Reyes. He found her after 15 minutes of looking sitting with the 3 recovered hostages in the outer room of the medical station. She was not doing anything official. She was sitting in a chair with a cup of coffee. Better coffee than the operations tent version, because the medical station ran a better machine, and she was listening to Gerald Forsyth talk. Forsyth was talking in the way people talk when they've been held somewhere against their will for 11 days, and they finally have the space and the safety to process it, not linearly, not in the organized sequence of a debrief, but circuitously doubling back, landing on details that seemed small and carrying them with a weight that made it clear they were not small. He was talking about a guard who had been young, maybe 19, who had brought them water without being told to, and who had looked at the floor when he did it. He was talking about the specific quality of the dark in the room where they'd been held the way it had weight. He was talking about sounds he'd learned to interpret, which footsteps meant a routine check and which meant something else was happening. Vera was listening with her full attention. Not the polite attention of someone managing a social obligation. The real kind. The kind that costs something. Hale stood at the entrance for a moment before she noticed him, and in that moment he saw something he hadn't expected to see: the version of her that existed when she wasn't evaluating anyone, when she wasn't calculating atmospheric data, or managing a satellite communication in a canyon, or delivering hard truths to commanders who needed them. The version that just sat with people who had been through something and made sure they knew someone was listening. She noticed him. She didn't move immediately. She held up one finger, wait, and turned back to Forsyth and said something quietly. He nodded. She touched his arm briefly, the way someone does when they mean "I'll be back," not "I'm leaving," and stood and came to the entrance. "The report came in," Hale said. "I know. I received a copy from JSOC Command 40 minutes ago." He looked at her. "You already read it?" "I did." "And?" She studied him for a moment. "I think it's accurate. The modified flag or the adaptive recognition language?" "Both." She paused. "The modified flag is accurate because the initial dismissal happened, and it was the pattern. The adaptive recognition is accurate because what you did in the canyon calling, when you could still affect the outcome before you had to, that's harder than it looks. Most people wait until they have no other choice. You called when you still had a choice. It cost you something." "It cost me less than I deserve to pay," he said. She didn't argue with that. She just waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to tell me the honest version, not the institutional version." "I usually only have the honest version." "I know. That's why I'm asking." He looked at her directly. "In 17 years, all the evaluations, all the commanders who looked at you the way I looked at you at that gate, how many of them figured it out before it cost someone something?" The question landed in the space between them and stayed there. Vera looked past him for a moment, not away from the question, but through it, the way you look when you're being accurate rather than careful. "4," she said. In 17 years, 4 commanders who recalibrated before a consequence forced them to. Out of how many evaluated? A pause. 31. Hale felt that number settle on him. Not 4 out of 31 who failed. 4 out of 31 who didn't. 27 missions, 27 units, where the blind spot had to bleed before the commander believed it existed. What happened in those 27? He asked. Outcomes varied, she said. And then because she was Vera Callaway, and she did not hide behind institutional language when a direct answer was available. 3 of them had casualties that a full asset deployment would have prevented. 1 was pulled from command after the evaluation and reassigned to a training role. The rest adapted afterward, did better work, became better commanders, but afterward. After the damage. After the damage, she confirmed. He nodded slowly. He put his hand in his pocket and touched the folded report without taking it out. The protocol JSOC is requiring the pre-mission planning review. Yes. It should have existed before I needed it mandated. Yes, she said again. Same word, different weight. I want your input on how to implement it, he said. Not the JSOC template version, the version that actually works. You've seen 31 units. You know what the checklist looks like when it's real versus when it's being performed for the record. She looked at him with the expression he was learning to read as her recalibrating, updating the data she had on him, adjusting the model. That's outside the scope of my evaluation assignment, she said. I know. It would require me to extend my time at this base. I know that too. Why do you want my version specifically? I thought about the right way to say it. Because you built a firing solution for a 380-meter shot in 90 minutes using a base's atmospheric sensor data that nobody else had bothered to analyze. And then you wrote it in the margin of a printout and left it on my table because you knew I wasn't going to listen to you directly. He paused. The person who builds that solution and delivers it that way understands something about working inside a system that doesn't see you yet. I want that understanding in the protocol, not the version designed by people who've always been visible. The silence that followed was the longest of any of the silences they'd shared. It lasted long enough that Forsyth's voice drifted to them from the inner room, still talking, still processing, still laying out the specific details of 11 days in the particular order his mind needed to put them. Then Vera said, 3 days. 3 days, he agreed. She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to it on her face, and it was brief, but it was there. You drive a hard bargain for someone who owes me an apology he hasn't fully delivered yet. I was getting there, he said. Get there, she said. He straightened. Not performatively. The way a person straightens when they are about to say something they have thought about and mean. I dismissed you at the gate in 15 seconds, based on what you were carrying and how you looked, and the fact that you didn't fit the picture I had in my head of who belonged on this mission. I was wrong to do it. I was wrong in a way that cost my team, and I was wrong in a way that cost you, because you had to go around me instead of working with me, and everything you did on that ridge, you did alone when you should have had support. He paused. I am sorry for all of it. Not the modified flag kind of sorry, the real kind. She held his gaze. Accepted, she said, simply completely without making him wait for it. She turned and went back to Forsyth. Hale walked back to the operations tent. His team was assembled there, not because he had called them, but because the nature of the post-mission period was that people gravitated toward the same space, running on the shared rhythm of people who had been through something together and were not quite done processing it. Okafor was there. Vega was there. Whitmore was in the far corner doing the thing he always did after a hard mission, which was methodically cleaning and inspecting equipment that didn't need cleaning or inspecting, because it gave his hands something certain to do, while his mind caught up with what his body had been through. Hale stood in front of them. He had not called this meeting. He was calling it now. The evaluation report came in, he said. Nobody spoke. Modified flag. Mandatory protocol addition. No reassignment. He paused. The protocol is a pre-mission planning review that formally assesses any available asset before exclusion decisions are made. We're implementing it in a way that goes beyond the JSOC template with input from the evaluator. He looked at the room. I want each of you to understand something, and I want it to come from me directly, rather than filtering through the debrief record. What happened at the gate was my call, my mistake, and my failure to fix it until the field forced me to. It is on my record, and it belongs there. It should be on my record. Vega looked at him with the straightforward intensity he brought to everything. Commander, with respect, the team doesn't hold it against you. I know, Hale said. I hold it against me, and that's appropriate. What I'm asking from you is not absolution. What I'm asking is that you hold me to the new standard. Call it when you see it. If I'm making a 15-second decision about an asset or a person or a piece of information, tell me. Okafor already does this, and I don't always love it, and it has saved lives. I am formally asking all of you to do the same. Whitmore had stopped cleaning the equipment. He was looking at Hale with an expression that was hard to fully decode, not because it was complex, but because it was very simple, and simple things sometimes take a moment to register. I was looking at his commander the way a person looks at someone they already respected and have just been given a reason to respect differently. You know, most commanders don't do this, Whitmore said. I know. The report comes in, they brief the protocol change, they move on. They don't stand in front of the team and put it on themselves like this. I know that too, Hale said. That's part of the pattern the flag identified. The part where protecting the appearance of authority becomes more important than the authority doing what it's supposed to do. He paused. I am trying to not be that. Okafor said from his corner of the room. She's staying 3 more days. Yes. To build the protocol with you. Yes. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then, good. That single word from David Okafor, who had 9 years of evidence-based opinions about what was and wasn't good, settled into the room with a weight that exceeded its syllable count. The day moved forward. The way days at a forward operating base move, in the combination of structured activity and unstructured waiting that defines the rhythm of a life lived in operational cycles. Vera spent the morning with Forsyth and the other 2 hostages, not in any official capacity, just present. She spent the early afternoon with Meta, who had apparently identified in Vera a professional counterpart she had not expected to find, and who was not wasting the opportunity. Hale observed this from across the base without interrupting it, because some things in the world are working correctly, and the right response to things working correctly is to leave them alone. At Woman 400. Vera came to the operations tent and sat across from Hale with a notebook, a different one than the unmarked one he'd seen in the transient accommodations. This one with a unit designation on the cover that he didn't recognize, and they began. She started not with the protocol itself, but with questions. And not operational questions, questions about his process. How he built a mission plan from initial parameters. How he decided which assets to include in the initial assessment versus which he excluded before formal evaluation. What information he relied on, and what information he instinctively discounted, and why. He answered honestly. He answered more honestly than he had ever answered any debrief or evaluation, partly because she asked with the kind of precision that made evasion feel like wasted effort, and partly because he had decided sometime in the previous 71 hours that the halfway version of the lesson Vera Callaway had come to teach him was not worth taking. She wrote while he talked. She didn't look up while she wrote. She asked follow-up questions that arrived like scalpels, not to wound, but to find exactly the right spot, the exact moment where the process had a seam. You exclude based on pattern recognition, she said at one point. Not a question. Yes, he said. 14 years of successful missions have made your pattern recognition very fast. Yes. The problem with very fast pattern recognition, she said, still writing, is that it is also very efficient at confirming itself. You look at a situation, your pattern recognizes something familiar, and you respond to the familiar thing, rather than the actual thing. She looked up. The gate. What pattern did I trigger? He had thought about this. He had thought about it carefully because he had known she would ask it, and he had wanted to have the real answer, not the comfortable one. Unsupported lone operator, no visible team integration equipment load. Inconsistent with standard unit deployment, arrived without advance coordination with me specifically. He paused. Every one of those is a legitimate operational concern, and every one of them applied to you, and none of them told me what you could do. She wrote that down, word for word as he'd said it. Say that last sentence again. None of them told me what you could do. She wrote it. She underlined it. She looked at it for a moment. That's the sentence, she said. That's what the protocol needs to interrupt. The moment between the pattern and the decision. The moment where the question should be, what can this person do? But the question actually being asked is, does this person match the pattern I already have? She tapped the pen against the notebook. If that question gets asked and answered before the exclusion decision is made, the gate scene doesn't happen. Or it happens differently. He looked at the sentence on her notebook from across the table. That seems almost too simple. Most load-bearing truths are simple, she said. They're not easy, but they're simple. They worked for 3 hours. By the end of it, the notebook had 12 pages of Vera's precise handwriting and the beginning of something that looked like a procedure, not the bureaucratic kind that gets filed and forgotten, but the operational kind built from specific failure points and specific corrections. The kind of document that carries the weight of the thing that generated it. Meta appeared at the tent entrance at 17:10. She was carrying a tablet, and her expression had the particular quality it got when she had found something in a dataset that changed the shape of what she'd thought she was looking at. "Commander," she said. "Callaway." She looked at both of them. "I've been reviewing the mission outcome data against the evaluation protocol database, the historical records from JSOC Evaluation Command." She paused. "I found something." Hale gestured for her to come in. She set the tablet on the table between them. The screen showed a data comparison mission outcomes from units that had received the standard mandatory protocol versus mission outcomes from units that had received what the database classified as extended evaluator engagement, meaning the evaluator had stayed beyond the initial assessment to work with the unit directly. The difference in the numbers was not subtle. Units with extended evaluator engagement, Meta said, show a 34% reduction in what the database calls preventable asset utilization failures in the 18 months following evaluation. That's the technical term for situations where an available asset was excluded from a mission and the exclusion contributed to a negative outcome. Hale looked at the numbers. Then he looked at Vera. Vera was looking at the tablet with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Something had moved there briefly, quickly controlled, but it had been there. The expression of someone who has known a thing for a long time in the abstract and is looking at it confirmed in numbers for the first time. "You've never seen this data," he said. "Evaluators don't have access to the aggregate outcome database," she said. Her voice was level, but something in it was different. "We submit records. We receive confirmation of determinations. We don't see what happens afterward." The room was very quiet. "Vera," Meta said, and she used the first name without apparent decision. Naturally, the way you use someone's name when a thing has become personal. 31 evaluations over 17 years. 31 units. If the extended engagement numbers held even partially. "Don't," Vera said. Not harshly, just firmly. The way you say it when someone is about to tell you something you are not yet ready to hear. Meta stopped. Vera looked at the tablet for another moment. She looked at the 34% reduction and everything it implied about 17 years of moving from one base to the next, doing the assessment, filing the record, and leaving before the next mission, before the protocol changed, before the numbers shifted. She looked at it, and she let herself feel whatever she felt, and then she folded that feeling into the place where she kept things that required more time than the present offered, and she looked up. "Put the data in the protocol document," she said. "In the section on extended engagement value. It belongs there." Meta looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said it the way people say things when the title is not just a rank, but something they mean. Vera turned back to Hale. "We have more work to do," she said. "We have more work to do," he agreed. They kept working. The sun moved across the sky, and the tent got hot in the specific baking way of desert afternoons, and someone brought water without being asked, and the notebook accumulated pages, and the protocol took shape slowly and specifically built from the evidence of what had gone wrong, and the precision of a mind that had spent 17 years understanding why. At one point, late in the afternoon, Hale said, "The 4 commanders, the ones who figured it out before the consequence. What did they have in common?" Vera thought about it. Really thought, not quickly, but with the deliberate quality of someone being accurate. "They asked the question," she said finally. "Not always out loud, but at some point in the process, they stopped and asked what they didn't know about the person in front of them. Not what the person didn't have or didn't look like or didn't fit. What they didn't yet know." Hale sat with that. "That's the question I didn't ask." No, she said, "but you're asking it now." He looked at her. "Is it too late to be in that group, the 4? She held his gaze steadily. "You called in the canyon when you still had a choice. You requested the complete record knowing it would affect your career. You stood in front of your team and put the failure on yourself." A pause. "What do you think?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about Forsyth's hand in his at the medical station door. He thought about the 3 figures who had been in a room for 11 days and who were now somewhere safe. He thought about the figure he'd seen on the ridge in the growing gray light small against the sky, watching the helicopter move away. He thought about the 5 people he hadn't been able to save in 14 years of doing this, and whether any of them might have had a different outcome if he had asked that question sooner, in that mission with that team in that moment. He couldn't know. That was the nature of the question. It pointed at a door that couldn't be opened from this side. But he could know what came next. "I think," he said, "that the protocol we're building is the most important operational document this unit has ever produced. More important than any mission plan I've written. Because a mission plan serves one mission. This serves every mission after it." Vera wrote something in the notebook. She wrote it without commenting on it. She wrote it the way she wrote everything else, precisely, completely, without decoration. He looked at the page. She had written his words down, all of them. He understood then that the evaluation was not over. It had changed shape. The formal assessment was complete. The report was filed. The determination had been made. But the work of understanding the deeper, slower work of a commander, rebuilding the way he saw, that was still happening. And Vera was still watching it. Not for JSOC, not for the record. For the same reason, she had climbed the ridge in the dark, with no orders and no backup. Because it was worth watching. Because what a person became after they understood what they'd gotten wrong mattered as much as the moment of getting it wrong. Maybe more. He picked up his pen. He said, "Where were we?" And they went back to work, and outside the tent, the desert did what deserts do, which is persist. Ancient and indifferent and entirely uninterested in the particular dramas of the humans moving across its surface. Except that in this tent, in this afternoon, 2 people were building something that might save lives that the desert would otherwise claim. That seemed to Hale like enough. The protocol document was finished on the 3rd morning. It was 47 pages. Not a template, not a checklist disguised as a process, a living document built from specific failures, specific corrections, and the accumulated understanding of 17 years of watching what happened when capable people got looked past by the systems designed to use them. Vera had written the structural sections. Hale had written the implementation sections. Meta had contributed the data architecture, the outcome comparisons, the historical analysis, the language that gave the thing its evidentiary backbone. Okafor had read the entire document the previous evening sitting in the operations tent long after everyone else had gone, and had come back the next morning with 7 specific suggestions written in his particular compact handwriting, each one precise enough that Vera incorporated 6 of them verbatim and argued about the 7th with Hale for 40 minutes before he conceded she was right. And Okafor had been right, and he incorporated that one too. It was by any reasonable measure the best piece of operational documentation Hale had ever been part of producing. He knew that when he read the final version. He knew it the way you know when something is exactly what it was supposed to be, not because it's perfect, but because it's honest. Because every word in it came from something real. Vera sent it to JSOC Evaluation Command at 084 on the 3rd day. She sent a copy to the base commander, a copy to Okafor as the unit's senior enlisted advisor, and a copy to Meta in her capacity as intelligence support, because the protocol had an intelligence integration component that Meta had designed, and she deserved to hold the document that contained her work. Then Vera closed her notebook, the one with the 12 pages of their first conversation and everything that had followed. She closed it and put it in her pack without ceremony. Hale watched her do it. He was across the tent reviewing the final formatted version on screen, and he watched her close the notebook, and he understood what that meant. The work was done. The 3 days were done. What came after the closing of the notebook was the part of the process she had described to him at the beginning. She moved to the next assignment. He had known this was coming. He had known it since the first morning when she said 3 days with the simple finality of someone stating a fact rather than making a proposal. And knowing it hadn't made the tent feel any less different than it had felt 4 days ago before she had arrived at the gate, and he had thrown her case into the sand, and the entire architecture of what he thought he understood had begun to shift. He did not say any of that. Instead he said, "When does your transport leave?" 1300, she said. He looked at his watch. It was 0912. He had 4 hours and 48 minutes. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it clearly, so there's no ambiguity about what I'm asking." She looked at him with the patient expression. "All right. Your full operational file," he said. "The 43 classified pages that Meta flagged when you released it to base command access. The buried evaluation score at 23. The pipeline that didn't officially exist. The 6 years in environments you can't name at my clearance level." He paused. "Someone made the decision to bury that score. Someone decided that the result of your evaluation at 23 wasn't going to go where it should have gone. I want to know if that person was ever held accountable." The quality of the silence that followed was different from any of the silences they'd had before. It was not reflective. It was not organizing. It was the specific silence of someone deciding whether to open a door they have kept closed for a long time. Vera sat down. She hadn't been sitting. She sat now, which told him something about the weight of what he'd asked. "No," she said. One word. Flat and complete. "He retired with his rank intact," she continued. "Full pension. Commendation record clean." She said it with the particular evenness of someone who has processed a thing so thoroughly that the heat has gone out of it, leaving only the shape. "I filed a formal complaint at 24. It was reviewed by an officer who had served with him. The complaint was classified, and the outcome was that the original evaluation record would be maintained as filed, meaning buried, and that I should consider the matter resolved." Hale held very still. "You were 24 years old." "Yes." "And you stayed," he said. Not a question. "I stayed," she confirmed. "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because the work mattered regardless of whether the system recognized that I was doing it. And because leaving would have meant that the decision that officer made about me was final." She paused. "I decided it wasn't final. I decided that every year I stayed, and every mission I completed, and every commander I helped build something better was evidence that his decision was wrong. Not revenge. Evidence." Another pause. 17 years of evidence. Hale thought about a 24-year-old woman sitting across from a reviewing officer who had already decided what the outcome was going to be and making the decision to stay. Not because the system deserved it, because the work did. Because the people the work protected did. He thought about what that cost. Not in a single moment in 17 years of moments, every single one of which required that decision to be made again. "His name is in the file," Hale said. It was not a question. "His name is in the file," she confirmed. "And his buried evaluation of your record is in the file." "Everything is in this file," she said. "I released the full record to base command access, which means it is now part of the operational documentation for this base and this unit, and it follows the chain of accountability upward from there." She held his gaze steadily. "I've been waiting for the right moment to release that file for 3 years. The right moment was when I had a commander who asked for the complete record, knowing it would cost him something. Because a commander who accepts that kind of cost is a commander whose chain of accountability will carry the document where it needs to go. The tent went very quiet. Hale sat back. He felt the specific weight of understanding something that had been there the whole time, but had just become visible, the architecture of what she had done. Not just the mission, not just the protocol. The whole thing from the moment she had arrived at the gate had been built toward this. The evaluation had been real. The protocol had been real. The 3 days of work had been real. And underneath all of it, like load-bearing structure, was a document that had been waiting for the right commander and the right moment, and she had found both. "You chose this base," he said. "This evaluation." "I requested it," she said. "Your flag was one of 7 active flags I could have been assigned to. I chose yours. Because of my record. Because of your record, and because of one specific thing in your record that most people who reviewed it didn't flag as significant." She paused. 7 years ago in Afghanistan, a 22-year-old combat translator named Amara Haidari gave your team intelligence that altered a mission outcome. The after-action report credits the intelligence to a source not to her by name. But the supplemental record, the one you filed personally outside the standard reporting structure, credits her by name and recommends her for a formal commendation. Hale looked at her. "She didn't receive the commendation," Vera said. "The recommendation was administratively declined, but you filed it, knowing it would probably be declined, knowing it added paperwork and time and political friction that you didn't need." She held his gaze. "That's the thing in your record that most reviewers walked past. I didn't walk past it." He had filed that supplemental 7 years ago in the particular quiet of an after-action period, because Amara Haidari had given them information that had saved 2 lives and had not been in the room when the credit was distributed and had never asked to be. He had filed it because it was accurate, and because accurate mattered even when the system wasn't designed to act on it. I hadn't thought about it since. It had disappeared into the administrative record the way things do when they're declined and filed and forgotten. Vera had found it 17 years later and chosen his flag because of it. "Amara Haidari," he said, "is currently a senior intelligence analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency," Vera said. She filed her own formal complaint about the declined commendation 4 years ago as part of a broader DIA internal review. That complaint is also in the file. Hale stared at her. "The file," Vera said quietly, "is not just about me. It is about a pattern. My buried evaluation score is one instance. Amara's declined commendation is another. There are 11 others documented in 43 pages. 11 separate cases spanning 19 years with a traceable administrative thread connecting the evaluation officer who buried my score to 6 of the other 11 cases directly." She paused. He wasn't the only person responsible, but he was the center of it. The weight of 43 pages suddenly felt very different from how it had felt when Meta had first named the number. "You built a case," Hale said. "Over 3 years," she confirmed. "I built a case the way I build a firing solution. I collected the data, I verified the conditions, I calculated the trajectory, and I waited for the right moment and the right angle." A pause. "You were the right angle." Hale felt something move through him that was not simple and was not comfortable. It was the feeling of understanding the full shape of something. For the first time, not just the part of it that had been visible, not just the gate and the canyon and the protocol, but the whole structure, the long architecture of it, built with the patience of someone who had decided at 24 years old that evidence was more powerful than anger, and that 17 years of evidence was enough. "What happens to the file now?" he said. "It goes to the Inspector General's office," she said. "It's already been routed. I submitted it through Base Command Access at 0840 at the same time as the protocol document. The IG was the second recipient." She paused. "I needed the protocol to go first. I needed it on record that the purpose of this evaluation was operational improvement. That I came here to build something, not only to file a complaint. The complaint is real, and it needs to go where it needs to go. But the protocol is also real, and it would have been easy for someone to dismiss the complaint as the motive for the whole assignment." She looked at him with complete steadiness. "The protocol protects the complaint. The complaint couldn't protect the protocol. That's the order." He thought about the sequence of it. The precision. The way every element served the next, the way a firing solution serves the shot. Not just technically, but in terms of timing, of patience, of knowing when to wait, and when the conditions were finally right. "You are," he said slowly, "the most strategically capable person I have ever met." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She said it without arrogance. She said it the way someone says a thing that is simply true, the way she said everything. And for the first time since she had arrived at his gate, he heard in it the full weight of what it had cost her to know that about herself in a system that had spent 17 years disagreeing. Okafor appeared in his doorway. He looked at Hale. He looked at Vera. He read the room with the accuracy of 9 years of practice and said, "The IG office called the base commander 20 minutes ago." Hale looked at him. "The file triggered a priority review," Okafor said. "They want a formal interview with Callaway before she departs." He paused. "The base commander also wants to speak with you, Ethan, about the chain of documentation." The pace of the morning had just doubled. Vera stood. She was already composed, not performing composure, simply inhabiting it the way she inhabited everything. She picked up her pack. She looked at Hale. "This is what it looks like when it moves," she said, not triumphantly, with the steady acknowledgement of someone watching a thing they built begin to function. "It gets fast." "Are you ready for it?" he said. "I've been ready for it for 3 years," she said. "I've been ready for it since I was 24. She paused. The question was always whether the moment would be. She walked past Okafor into the corridor. He fell into step beside her without being asked, because that was David Okafor. He understood instinctively when someone needed the particular kind of company that doesn't require explanation. Hale went to the base commander's office. The next 4 hours moved at the speed of institutional machinery, suddenly switched from idle to full power. The IG representative, a colonel named Darris Whitfield, who had flown in from regional command within 3 hours of the file submission, which was itself a statement about how the 43 pages had landed, conducted a preliminary interview with Vera that lasted 90 minutes. Hale was interviewed separately. Meta was interviewed about the data methodology she had used to build the outcome analysis. Okafor was interviewed about the mission itself, specifically about the canyon ambush and the asset deployment decision. Each of them told the truth. They had been doing that all along, and they continued doing it now, and the cumulative weight of their separate truths, told consistently and without coordination, built the kind of evidentiary picture that an IG investigation needed and rarely received this clearly, this fast. Whitfield found Hale after the interviews in the corridor outside the base commander's office. He was a tall man with the kind of economy of movement that came from a career spent covering large distances efficiently. He looked at Hale with the assessing quality of someone doing their job carefully. "The file is comprehensive," Whitfield said. "I know," Hale said. "The protocol document is also comprehensive, unusually so. We had good people building it." Whitfield looked at him for a moment. "Commander Hale, the IG process from here will take approximately 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, the subject of the investigation, the specific officer and associated administrative actions documented in the file will be formally notified and given opportunity to respond. That is standard. Understood." "What is not standard," Whitfield said, "is the quality of the evidentiary record supporting this complaint. In 22 years in this office, I have seen perhaps 3 complaint files with this level of documentation and cross-referenced support." He paused. "She built it carefully." "She builds everything carefully," Hale said. Whitfield nodded once. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then decided the something else was outside the scope of his professional role. He walked away. Hale found Vera at 12:05. She was outside the base, standing near the vehicle that would take her to the transport. The rifle case was at her feet. The pack was on her back. She was looking east at the ridge in the way she looked at terrain, not casually, but with the measuring attention of someone who had climbed it in the dark and knew exactly what it had asked of her. He walked up beside her. He stood there for a moment, looking at the ridge with her. "Whitfield said 3 cases in 22 years with documentation this solid," he said. "He told you that." "He told me that." She was quiet for a moment. It takes time to build something that holds under institutional weight. You can't rush it, and you can't skip the parts that are tedious. She paused. Most people who try to do what I did run out of patience before the documentation is complete. They file while the anger is fresh, and the record is thin, and the institution has enough room to dismiss it. She looked at the ridge. I waited until there was no room. 17 years of no room, he said. Yes. The desert around them was doing what it always did in the early afternoon, pressing down with a heat that was more like a physical presence than a temperature, the kind of heat that made everything feel slightly slowed and slightly heavy. It was not a comfortable heat. It was the heat of a place that did not particularly care about human comfort, and which in that indifference had a kind of honesty that Hale had always respected about it. Vera, he said. She turned. The next commander you evaluate, he said. They won't know what you built here. They won't know the file or the IG process or the 43 pages. They'll just see you arrive with a rifle case, and they'll make a decision in 15 seconds. Yes, she said. Does that make it harder? She looked at him steadily. Every time, she said. And every time I decide it doesn't matter. Because the work on the other side of that 15 seconds is still the work. It doesn't change because someone makes it difficult to reach. She paused. What changes is what happens when the commander recalibrates. Some of them do. I am always there for the ones who do. He thought about 4 commanders out of 31. He thought about the new shape of that number now, not a small number of successes, but a growing one. Because the protocol existed now. Because 43 pages were in the hands of people who would act on them. Because the pattern Vera had documented would be harder to maintain after today than it had been yesterday, and harder still after the IG process ran its course. What would you tell the 24-year-old version of yourself? He said. If you could. She considered it. Not quickly, with the real consideration she brought to things that deserved it. I would tell her that the work is worth more than the recognition. I would tell her that 17 years feels long from the inside and short from the outside, which means the patience is harder than it sounds, but the result is larger than it looks. She paused. And I would tell her that there will be a morning in a desert where a commander throws her case in the sand and she should pick it up. Because that morning is the one. Hale looked at her. He felt the fullness of that, the specific weight of being told by someone that you were the morning they had been building toward, and the responsibility that came with it. Not just the protocol, not just the IG process, but the ongoing weight of being the commander who got it right when she finally found one who could. I won't waste it, he said. I know you won't, she said. And she meant it the way she meant everything, completely without decoration, because the truth of it was sufficient. The transport vehicle was ready. The driver was waiting with the particular patience of military drivers who understand that their schedule serves the mission and not the other way around. Vera picked up the rifle case. She turned toward the vehicle. She stopped. She turned back. The 43 pages, she said. The last page. The final entry in the documented pattern. She held his gaze. It's a commendation recommendation, formally submitted by me to JSOC Command at the time of file release. A pause. For Sergeant First Class Priya Mehta, for identifying the satellite window discrepancy and flagging it through proper channels under pressure, and for the data methodology she contributed to the protocol document, and for the outcome analysis that established the evidentiary value of extended evaluator engagement. Another pause. She is exactly the kind of person the system has been looking past. I wanted to make sure she was seen. Hale felt something move through his chest that was clean and clear and not complicated at all. Does she know? He said. She will when the file is processed. A small pause. Make sure she knows you know. Make sure she hears it from her commander before she hears it from a document. He nodded. I will. She looked at him one final time with the patient expression that he now understood completely, the one that wasn't angry and wasn't performing and wasn't asking for anything. The one that had been built over 17 years of doing the work, regardless of whether anyone was watching, and that had settled into her the way things settle into people when they have been the same person for long enough that they no longer need to think about it. She walked to the vehicle. She put the rifle case inside. She got in. The vehicle moved. Hale stood at the edge of the base and watched it go, and he did not look away until it disappeared into the distance, and the heat shimmer closed behind it, the way the desert always closed behind things, indifferent and complete. He turned back to the base. He walked to intelligence support. Meta was at her station because Meta was always working, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of someone who is ready for whatever information is about to arrive. He said, "The last page of Vera's file. There's a commendation recommendation." Meta went still. "For you," he said. "Filed with JSOC command at the time of release. Your satellite window flag, your data methodology, the outcome analysis." He paused. "She documented you. She made sure the system saw you." Meta looked at him. The professional neutrality she maintained with such consistency, the careful, competent flatness that was her operational face moved. Not dramatically, not loudly. But it moved, and underneath it was something that had been there for a long time, without being named, the particular quality of a person who has done good work in rooms where that work was noted by everyone except the people who could do something about it. Her eyes were bright for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took a breath, and the neutrality reassembled itself, but it reassembled around something different than what had been there before. Something that would not need to be hidden in quite the same way from now on. "She didn't tell me," Meta said. "No," Hale said. "She didn't. She told me to make sure you heard it from me before you heard it from a document." Meta looked at the door through which Vera had long since walked out toward a vehicle, toward a transport, toward the next base, and the next flag, and the next commander, who would make a decision in 15 seconds and have to live with what came after. "She sees everything," Meta said quietly, not to Hale specifically, to the fact of it. "Everything," Hale agreed. "That's the job." He left her there and walked back through the base past the operations tent where the protocol document lived in the system, past the medical station where Forsyth and the two women had been this morning and would be gone by tomorrow, back to his office where the mission record waited with everything that had happened laid out in the order. It had happened accurate and complete. He sat down. He opened the mission record. He read through it from the beginning. The planning phase, the gate decision, the canyon, the ridge, the shots, the extraction, the debrief, the evaluation report, the protocol, the file, the IG process, all of it in the order. It had unfolded the way you read something when you want to understand the full shape of it, rather than just the outcome. He read to the end. He sat with the end for a long time, and then he opened a new document. He wrote at the top of it in the plain factual language that mission records required the beginning of what would become the after-action addendum, the formal account of what the evaluation had revealed and what the unit had built in response. The document that would follow the protocol into the JSOC system and give it context. He wrote for an hour. When he was done, he read it back. It was accurate. It was complete. It named every person who had contributed to every decision, including the wrong ones, including his own. It gave credit where credit had been earned, and it placed responsibility where responsibility belonged. He filed it. Then he picked up his comm and called Okafor. "It's done," he said. "The addendum," Okafor said. "Everything. The addendum, the protocol filing, the IG documentation chain. All of it is where it needs to be." A pause. Then Okafor said, "She built something that's going to outlast this base, didn't she?" It was not a question. It had the quality of a statement that a person makes when they have been thinking about a thing and have arrived at the answer and are saying it out loud to confirm that it's real. "Yes," Hale said. "She did." Another pause. "She built it, and she walked away without watching it work." "That's who she is," Hale said. "She never needed to watch it. She built it to work without her." He set the comm down. He looked at the filed documents, the protocol, the addendum, the chain that connected them to the IG process, and from there to the accountability that 43 pages of evidence had spent 3 years demanding. I thought about a woman on a ridge in the dark, with a rifle she had carried onto a base that had rejected her in the service of a mission that hadn't invited her for a team that hadn't known it needed her. I thought about what it meant to be that certain of the value of your own work. not certain that the world would recognize it, certain that it was worth doing regardless, certain enough to climb the ridge, certain enough to take the shot, certain enough to file the record and walk away and trust that the right people in the right moment would carry it forward. She had trusted him with that. He intended to spend the rest of his career being worth the trust. Vera Callaway did not need a ceremony. She did not need applause or recognition or a formal farewell from the base she had transformed in 4 days without anyone's permission. She needed none of those things because she had never done the work for any of them. She had done it because it was true, and because true things done with patience and precision, and the particular courage of someone who has decided that the work matters more than whether anyone is watching, have a way of outlasting every obstacle placed between them and the people they were built to protect. The desert was exactly as large and indifferent as it had always been. The base was exactly as operational and ongoing as it had been before she arrived. The ridge to the east was exactly as silent as it was every other morning, but the system that sent operators into danger and the protocol that governed how their capabilities